All right, my name is Heather Gray, and the program is Just Peace, and I want to welcome you all to our discussion this evening. We're going to talk about Cliff Kuhn, who we lost in November of 2015. We have a lot to talk about his background because he played a central role here at WRFG, and I'm thrilled to tell you we have here in the studio with us Harlon Joye, WRFG's own Harlon Joye, one of the critical founders of WRFG. Welcome. Yeah. And we also have Bernard West, who worked with Harlon and Cliff Kuhn actually on the Living Atlanta series. Has been a part of the WRFG community for a long time. Am I right, Bernard?
Without a doubt. Good evening.
Welcome. And we also have here in the studio Kevin Caron on the board and also a visitor, Allison. Welcome, Allison. Glad you're with us this evening.
You can say hi, Allison.
Hi.
Before we go any further, though, I want you to know that the opinions expressed on Just Peace do not necessarily reflect those of Radio Free Georgia Broadcasting Foundation, Incorporated, its staff, or volunteers, and portions of the program are pre-recorded. Again, we lost Cliff Kuhn in November of 2015. It was a shock for us all. He was only 63 years old, which to some of us is really quite young. Am I right, Bernard? That's one of the first things. He was young.
I'm glad you asked Bernard about it.
But it was shocking for us. He had not been sick that we knew of, but he died of a heart attack, a surprising heart attack. And, you know, one of the interesting things about Cliff that many of us around the city know is that he was always riding his bike everywhere. It was such a loss for us because Cliff had played such a central role, not only at WRFG in its early history, but also in the city of Atlanta. He, at the time of his death, was a professor of history at Georgia State University and the executive director of the Oral History Organization. And he was, I believe, the first executive director that the Oral History Association ever had, actually, and he brought that association to Atlanta, Georgia, which was really so incredibly significant. The other thing I want to say about Cliff, based on some of the work that he did here at WRFG and then subsequent research in oral history, he was teaching the city of Atlanta, actually, about Atlanta's history. And a lot of that stems back through the work that he did here at WRFG in the 1970s. So that's what we primarily want to talk about this evening, is Cliff's work and WRFG's project, the Living Atlanta series it was called, or the radio series, which was ultimately made into a book. So anyway, I'm so thrilled to have Harlon, you here in the studio, and also Bernard West. You both were involved in this early work, the early development of the whole concept of doing this Living Atlanta series. So, Harlon, I'm going to start with you. Where in the world did you come up with this idea of doing this amazing and unique history project?
Well, quite frankly, it wasn't where I started. I started looking at several possible methods of financing the station, bringing some money in. And one of them was the idea of having senior citizens come in and talk about their life in Atlanta. That was a start. And I went down and talked to Michael Lomax, who was at that time the head of the
Bureau of
Cultural Affairs, yeah. And he thought that this one about talking to senior citizens might be somewhere. So he put me in touch with somebody that works in his office, Jack Bagriansky. Jack's still around. See him every now and then. And Jack and I sat down and talked about it, and they said, well, there might be something that the National Endowment for Humanities would be interested in. And so we started working out how that might work. And in doing that, we came up really more with the idea of what Living Atlanta became to be, because the idea of it as a history project, there was more than just an informal gathering of people, but bringing people in the station took root then. And I wrote it up finally for a proposal to the National Endowment in 77, either late 76 or early 77. And they got back in touch with me about some things they wanted done, and I started reaching for the historians that they required to be involved in a project like this. And I talked to Dana White at Emory, and Crimmins, what's Crimmins' first name?
Tim Crimmins.
Ken
Timothy.
Crimmins at Georgia State, and Alton Hornsby over at Atlanta University. And we worked on the thing a little bit.
And Dr. Hornsby was in what department at Atlanta University?
The history.
History department, yeah. He was head of history at AU, right.
Yeah.
At Morehouse.
At Morehouse, thank you.
So, anyway, the Living Atlanta, NEH then said, okay, we will fund a pilot project to see what you're doing. And so they sent me a $20,000. And I hired Bernard, who Dana recommended, and I hired Marcus Barksdale, who was teaching history over at Morehouse, I guess. Marcellus, I'm sorry. And George Mitchell, who has done a lot of photography and writing about
George.
Blues particularly.
Yes, right. Blues, but, the history of Atlanta as well.
Yeah.
He wrote the famous book on Ponce de Leon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we did a pilot. We decided to do Atlanta University complex. It's sort of history and the whole involvement during this period. And we picked the period looking back to when we thought we could get people for. And the embarkations that made sense was the beginning. It was World War I and the end of World War II. So that's basically what our parameters were.
I want to just stop here for a moment, Harlon. Why did you choose that period?
Availability of people, for one thing.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
And also, things started happening after World War II. There were a lot of changes started that weren't there prior to the end of World War II, including the right for blacks to vote in the city in terms of the primaries. Change in the primary process, happened right at that time. Integration of the police department happened right at that time. So we sort of stopped at that point, and we talked about those two things to some degree, particularly integration of the police department, and we didn't go past that. And
let me just step in here one more time. I'm sorry, but the other thing is that between that period was also the New Deal as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, which
but it was only part of it.
Was only part of it, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And the other parts, too, well, we picked Atlanta University, and we picked railroads. Railroads are a huge, major economic and cultural integer in the whole city during that whole period of time. Atlanta was a railroad city, and railroad they entered in everything from politics to transportation to, like I say, the whole economic situation. So, and also railroads were pretty easy to pick up and find people who worked in the railroad at the early period of time.
Why is that?
Because the retirement process, you could find a list of people who retired in the railroad.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah. And so we started, and then I said, how are we going to do this in 2 programs? So I finally thought, well, we got the money. What we'll do is we'll do 2 on Atlanta University, the whole complex. Because the complex at the time, at the beginning, was scattered out. Clark wasn't over there, and Morris Brown weren't over there. Neither one of them over.
Not until later.
Yeah.
Not until later.
Interesting.
Yeah, they were on this side of town, on the east side of town.
Before they went to the Atlanta University area, is that?
Right.
Yeah.
They were in southeast Atlanta, down south of the stadium in that area. They had been located, Morris Brown, and they consolidated to the near west side. But it was a lot of issues that went into why that consolidation occurred as well. But we did a total of 5 programs in the pilot, 3 on the railroads, 2 on the Atlanta University Center Complex.
And the railroads we divided up in terms of conductors and passenger conveyances, and the segregation situation there, for example, engineers and firemen, and then the other workers, the brakemen and all of those type of workers, the maintenance workers, and the workers that kept the train running while it was running, if they weren't shoveling coal and putting steam to the engines. And so that was what we covered. And during this period of time, too, I started concentrating more and more on in fact, that we could look at segregation in the city and break it, make some interesting comments and analysis concerning segregation in Atlanta with the whole section of programs. And so we sent it back and asked for the money to do a total of 50 programs, 45 more programs.
Wait, so this was not the pilot project?
No,
this
when
was...
we sent the pilot project back, they accepted the pilot
They accepted
project.
it?
Yeah. They made some comments and some changes they wanted, and so that was easy to accommodate. Bernard came on full-time, and Cliff, who had been away, Cliff and I had talked a little bit about the history of Atlanta before this, and so he was back in Atlanta, and so I hired Cliff and Bernard to do interviews, and we broke the interviews down. So Bernard, who's Afro-American, did the black interviews, and Cliff did the white interviews.
Yeah, so that's interesting. We will talk a little bit about that, but before we do, I just want to talk to Bernard for a second. Now, Bernard, you were brought onto the project.
Actually, Dana White, who had been my advisor in graduate school at Emory, had introduced me to Harlon and recommended me for the opportunity with the Live in Atlanta.
I see. So you were a student of history?
Yes.
Okay. And what area of history did you study?
I was at the I was in the Institute of Liberal Arts.
I see.
At Emory.
Okay.
And I was looking at the I was actually looking at the postbellum period, that period that followed the Civil War.
Right.
But the kind of work that I was doing had lent itself to this particular project.
Sounds like it. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a moment. Stay tuned. Right again, my name is Heather Gray, and the program is Just Peace, and we're talking tonight about quite a few things, but we're talking about Cliff Kuhn, who we lost in November of 2015. He played a central role, actually, at WRFG, and we're talking also primarily about the work that Cliff and others did on the Living Atlanta, a research project that took place in the late 1970s. And I need to say that this was a unique project, certainly in the South and probably in the country, but for this period. Am I right, Bernard? This was really unique.
Well, it continues to be unique because there's no one had done anything like this prior to Living Atlanta, and I don't think too many things have been done on that scale subsequent to Living Atlanta.
Yeah, no, it's just really a fascinating project. I do want to mention also, and Harlan, correct me if I'm wrong, this was ultimately made into a book, but initially the project was for a radio series.
Oh yeah, half-hour programs each. So it's 25 hours of programming.
25 hours of programming. Now, you hired Cliff and after you had completed the pilot project, which NEH, right, accepted, and then we got additional monies, or you got additional monies for actually beginning the project. And and that project started in 1978. It took a year, I understand. Is that correct, or 2 years?
It took 2 years to do the project. It took 1 year to do the interviews, and
1 year to compile it all?
Bernard and Cliff worked full-time on the project for 1 year, and then the next year was finishing up all the production that had to be done. And that took me another year to do that. And get that done.
All right, so I need to tell you all at the beginning of the show, Bernard said, Heather, are we going to do this interview like we did with the Living Atlanta series? Having discussions on where to proceed and what to do. In some ways, it's true because we are doing that to a degree because the project was so important and so immense and so broad. But how did you all do this? Harlan, did you and Bernard and Cliff get together and talk about who to approach and what to talk about? How did you do this?
Oh, yeah. Well, first there was, when I put the second proposal in the NEH, I had to have a list of what they were talking about in general.
An outline.
And I'd worked that out. I'd probably talked to Cliff about some of that, Bernard, and I'd probably talked about it. And I talked to Dana and Crimmins and Hornsby about it, too. And we sort of worked out what possible program topics. And then when we got together, we had to work out what kind of questions we wanted, what were the questions we wanted for ask everybody,
right?
What were the topics that we wanted to try to find that we wanted to fish for, and then the specific topics. Where were we going to find people that covered this specific topic? And that's the way we went. The interviews, we got all that in line, and then for every interview, we had to have a broad history outline that somebody knowing something about the area did.
Right, and perhaps with some context even of those to interview.
That was part of the difficulty of doing this project, is identifying and locating the people that would get interviewed to flesh out the skeletons that had been prepared. We would get a broad-based outline, and we had several questions that would just be general questions about what the conditions of life were like in Atlanta for the people who were experiencing it. And then we would then find out, like if we were doing a program on maize, we would kind of give them a little head to go and do what they wanted to do, tell us about their life as it was unfolding and the kinds of things they had to do subsequent to doing that work. And we did that for everybody that was involved, whether it was the owner of the baseball teams or the players of the baseball teams and the like. And
the Atlanta Crackers.
Yeah, the Atlanta Black Crackers.
The Atlanta Black Crackers.
We did not cover the Atlanta Crackers.
We didn't cover the Crackers.
Right.
We covered
they got covered too much.
Okay, fair enough.
The Atlanta Black Crackers.
All right.
But then Cliff and I, this was one of the areas, like say the area of baseball, for example. This was one of the areas that Cliff and I, we could swap off in terms of the interviews, because he got some interviews with some black baseball players, that he had managed to locate. So we were just bringing the information back in and making it available for the production then to occur.
All right, so now I want to get back to Cliff here about his interests as far as the interviews were concerned, because one of the things, as I look at the Living Atlanta, at the book and at the radio series, it was both oral history about what people were experiencing, in addition to information about resistance to oppression in Atlanta. Am I right?
Well, that became part of the process.
Yeah, right.
Very much so.
So what was Cliff interested in doing, and how? Let's talk a little bit about that. I have a list of some things that he ended up doing, but as far as the Living Atlanta project was concerned, what were his primary interests?
Cliff was the consummate historian. He just loved history, and he was able to go in and talk about history, understanding history, and for him, that was nothing historical that he didn't like. He liked it all, and his interviews, he had a really good ability of getting in and getting people to give it up.
Right.
They would give up the information, and Cliff was good at pulling it and extracting it from them.
Yeah, in talking with you, Bernard, before this program, you were mentioning about one interviewer who you were with, and this particular interviewer would just talk a lot and just was only able to extract a yes or no from the person they were interviewing, which is not really, I think, the role of as you say, a consummate historian or oral historian, which is to be able to draw that information from the person they're interviewing. Am I right?
Oh, yeah. Well, we learned on the job, and if you brought him back too many tapes with yes,
brought Harlon back
no,
too many tapes.
Yeah, you couldn't bring him back tapes with just yes.
Yes and a no.
He said, "You doing all the talking."
Yeah. So
no, because we weren't doing interviews. I mean, we were doing interviews, but what we wanted to have as programs were not interviews.
Yeah, we needed people to be able to say something that could be broadcast on the radio. And if they didn't say it, if the interviewer was saying everything, we didn't have anything to work with as far as producing a radio program.
Right. Now, Harlon, you also have a history background.
Do I have a history? Not really. My background's in sociology and economics.
Well, it's sort of a history. Sociology and economics, all right. Yeah. So, But again, like one of the critical things that people have been talking about since we lost Cliff is the work that he was doing in the city of Atlanta on the 1906 Race Riot. Now, this was not necessarily a part of the Living Atlanta series, was it? Because the 1906 Race Riot took place earlier than the project period time. It's just that people came forward during this project who had been alive during the 1906 Race Riot. Do you want to speak to that, Harlon?
Well, Bernard can too.
Both of you, please.
Yeah. We found that it popped up in places. You'd be talking. I think we threw this question in after a while about that.
It was one of the general questions.
Yeah, one of the general questions.
What do you mean a general question? Were you alive during this period, or?
Yeah. Well, you're old enough to remember this. Maybe. Do you remember anything about it? Questions like that.
I see.
The same thing about the 1917 fire. Yeah. Were you here for the fire? Were you involved in the fire? What do you know about the fire? And there were a number of others we popped in like that, and that's how we got. Because we had some broad programs also, like segregation, the just general looks at segregation. We introduced the programs. How many? There was 2 or 3. So the first couple were the etiquette of race relations. We had 2 programs. And
the etiquette. It sounds like you're trying to be racist and be polite. Is that what do you mean etiquette of?
Well,
there was some unspoken interactions between blacks and whites.
I see. And how you behaved.
How people behave with one another.
I see.
In terms of living at that time. Actually, this was pre-lunch kind of desegregation.
Yeah.
And people had to find a way to accommodate it.
I see.
And to accommodate each other. And the whole notion of racism, it was prevalent, and people had to find a way to deal with it, and so that I think that's what the etiquette of race relations.
I see. No, it absolutely makes sense.
It's the kind of things that we tried to talk about, and we would have people talk about what they did, when they encountered something that was overtly racist, but you still had to have a job, and how did you accommodate these overt acts, and so we got a whole program of people talking about on either side.
On both whites and blacks
both
talking
whites
about this.
and blacks.
Interesting. Bernard, let's get back to the 1906 Race Riot. So, to me, were you the ones, and Barbara Joye was also a part of that, was she not? Doing some interviews on the 1906 Race Riot, is that correct?
She wasn't doing interviews. She did a lot of some of the research on that one, but Bernard was involved in.
Yeah, I was.
You were doing interviews.
I did some of the interviews and helped put some of the programs
So
together.
For the 1906 Race Riot, remember, everyone, this project was done in 1978. So there were people who were alive. They must have been very young in 1906, most of them, I would think.
Yeah.
And
a number of them were grown and had.
We had some older people that we interviewed too.
Yeah. Well, I'm talking about they must have been young in 1906 is what I'm saying.
No, but what I mean is.
There were some who were older also.
Yeah, I mean.
Up in their 90s, perhaps?
Yeah. And so
in 1978.
They were adults at the time of 1906.
Okay, so you were interviewing and there were both blacks and whites who you interviewed.
Oh yeah.
Right, and now you were primarily interviewing the black.
I was primarily interviewing black people, yes,
folks
who had lived in Atlanta or were living in Atlanta at the time of the riot.
And Cliff was interviewing white folks.
Yes, who had lived in Atlanta at the time of the riot.
I see. So, why don't you all give the rationale for why you separated it out like that? Why did you do that?
Well, for the most part, we had talked about it, and I think that we tried cross race, but it's very difficult to do a cross racial interview when people have sore areas that they want to discuss, and it's much easier after you've gained the rapport within the interview. It's much easier to get people to come out and share with you that intimate feelings that they had experienced, had concerning this. It was a sensitive issue. It was tender, and it would in the very fact that it was a race riot, and the fact that you're having people then to go back to talk about it, it's much easier to talk to somebody who shares your perspective, who shares
at least
your ethnicity, if nothing else.
Now, Cliff was interviewing white folks. Could you talk a little bit about his experience with that? Could you share some of that in your discussion with Cliff about that?
Oh yeah, well, Cliff was a great interviewer,
right,
as well, and he could get people to tell on themselves. He got several people to tell on themselves, and if you go back and listen to the Living Atlanta series, you'll be able to hear some of these people who were telling on themselves.
That they perhaps did some outrageous things that they hadn't really talked about in the past.
Well, too, Cliff, I think, since I listened to all the stuff as it came in, some of the places where some of that came up most interestingly was with the police.
Yeah.
Which is interesting given today. But Cliff was talking to these policemen, had been policemen in the 1920s.
I see.
And they had some interesting things to say. Yeah, about everything from the Klan to the loitering on the streets, allegedly that you could pick up blacks for loitering. And sometimes the brutality, that didn't show up as much, but some of these others did. And even Chief Jenkins, we tried to interview mostly not top people, but we did interview top people.
I see.
We did interview names known in the city. Like one was Chief Jenkins, and Chief Jenkins talked about having to belong to the Klan pretty much to get ahead in the police department.
Was he the chief of police at the time?
Yeah. No, he was retired.
He was retired.
He was retired at the time of the interview, but we were talking about how Cliff could get people to tell
I see.
on
I
themselves.
see what you mean.
Okay, and
right.
so, but part of that is that in Atlanta, Atlanta was the imperial city for the Ku Klux Klan in the 20s and what have you, and that it was like being in the country club. If you didn't belong to the Klan at that time, you didn't get ahead. If you were white and living in Atlanta, and even the police chief admitted to being a member of the Klan. At one point, he later quit, but he admitted that he had to join at one time.
And who's the white? What was the county attorney that Cliff was talking to? Had been a major Klan person. What was his name?
Yeah, I don't remember his name, but I remember that. But he had been very high up, and he talked about the intricacies of being a member of the Klan at that time.
So I just want our listeners to know that you are listening to WRFG Atlanta 89.3 FM. My name is Heather Gray, and the program is Just Peace. And we're talking this evening about Cliff Kuhn, and primarily about his work actually in the Living Atlanta series, and about the Living Atlanta series project itself, which was something that that WRFG conducted in the late 1970s under the leadership of Harlon Joye, actually, who hired Cliff Kuhn, and also Bernard West, who we have here in the studio talking about this important project that won all kinds of awards. We can talk about that as well. But I do want to remind everyone that this was initially meant for a radio series, which it was. And actually, this radio series, the Living Atlanta radio series, I understand, Harlon, is now all over the country in various libraries and so forth. But it was ultimately made into a book that Cliff actually worked on. Now, Cliff ended up also, he did a number of interviews, I understand, from the Living Atlanta series and for the University of Georgia, that he did 150 Living Atlanta interviews. And he also did something on agriculture. Harlon, you want to speak to that a little bit?
I got a grant. It was a two-part grant. One part was from the Georgia Endowment for the Humanities, and one part was from a Presbyterian organization. I don't remember. It deals with hunger and food.
Okay, right.
And we did 5 programs covering agriculture in Georgia. And one was on chicken farming, one was on the whole grain situation. I'm trying to think what the others. One was on black farming specifically. Yeah.
But this was not a part of Living Atlanta. This was a separate project.
It was another project that we also
associated with
worked
it
on
somehow?
together.
Okay.
No,
all
it
right.
wasn't associated
Okay,
with it,
just
except
a
under
separate
that.
project.
Some of my credentials for getting money on other things like that was the fact that we'd done Living Atlanta.
I see. Then there was also the 1919 streetcar workers' strike that Cliff had a particular interest in and ended up writing a book about that, I believe. Could you all talk about that a little bit?
Yeah,
that was part of Living
That
Atlanta.
was one of the Living Atlanta programs, the streetcar strike.
Right. But so were you involved in interviewing on some of that as well, Bernard?
I don't know that I necessarily had. Yes, we did. I did talk about to some of the people that we interviewed. We did talk about that, and the fact that they were inconvenienced as a result of the strike. And I don't know that they had a lot of sympathy for the strikers, but because of the inconvenience on them. But we did talk some about that. Did you put any of that in that program?
I think I did put some of it, and then Cliff interviewed several streetcar workers that worked on the line at the time, and that were out on strike.
Was the strike successful?
No, not really.
No. No.
They made their statement, though, right?
Yeah. But the real thing is, and Cliff knew a lot about this, that from the period right before World War I, coming up to there, labor played a strong part in the city of Atlanta. The Labor Day parades here were big. There were 10,000 people out on Labor Day parades here. And one of the former railroad workers ran for mayor and gave one of the mayors a pretty hard time, beating him. So there was a lot of that. That's all I'm saying. And like I say, Cliff, that was an area Cliff had a lot more knowledge of than I did, or probably Bernard too.
Yes.
Well, let's go to another one of the interests that Cliff had, and that was the 1914-1915 strike at the Atlanta's Fulton Mills. What about that?
Okay, now that he covered outside of, he probably picked up some stuff about that when we interviewed textile workers. We did a program on textile workers because there were textile plants, two major ones, of course, Fulton Bag and the one out in West Side. What was the name of that one? I can't remember now.
With the Fulton Bag over here.
In Cabbagetown.
In Cabbagetown, yeah.
Cabbagetown.
Right.
And Cliff interviewed most of those folks because they were just about all white.
Right.
And most of them had come here, from up in North Georgia.
So now, was this, Harlon, was this like a separate project for him then?
No.
This was
yeah, that was a separate project. That was not part of Living Atlanta. And in any way other than what I'm saying is that he probably picked up some material. I can't remember if there was some in the programs or not, because it was really earlier than we were interested in dealing with.
Right. So the interesting thing is that this project provided the opportunity to meet and learn about a whole swath of peripheral issues and individuals. Am I right?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
It was just really interesting in that sense. Okay, so I'm just going through a list here of some, like Arthur Raper. What about him? Now Arthur Raper used to teach at Agnes Scott College, and this is another individual, I think, who Cliff actually met and interviewed during the Living Atlanta series, I understand. Is that correct?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And there were several people like Raper that Cliff really was admired after speaking with him. I'm trying to think of some of the other names. I might come across one right here. There were a couple that just taught at Georgia Tech that really impressed him. But anyway, yeah, he did several interviews during the Living Atlanta program. He went back to interview Raper twice, and then he did others later. And did a program for WRFG that won an NFC National
Community Broadcast.
Yeah, we're not getting it quite right. NFCB.
Yeah.
Yeah, National
Federation of Community Broadcasters.
We got it. That's
the
it.
National Federation
of Community
Broadcasters Award, exactly.
Yeah, as one of the best programs of that year.
Now, the Arthur Raper, at the time that Cliff died in November of the last year, he had been working actually for a few years on a book about Arthur Raper, who ended up doing a significant amount of work in the rural South as well with the Bureau of Agriculture Economics, but we will not go into that tonight. We'll do that at another time. Now, another important event that took place in Atlanta was the hanging of Leo Frank. Now, Cliff got involved in that as well. Would you all speak to that a little bit about what happened as far as Leo Frank is concerned?
I think that's part of a project that Cliff brought. I think he was already nursing that project.
Yeah,
he was nursing that project even when he came into the Living Atlanta.
I see.
But we I got a grant from the Georgia Endowment for Humanities to do the One Living Atlanta program.
Yeah.
As the Leo Frank, an hour program.
Right.
And we picked up a good bit of that in the other interviews. There were a number of people in the Jewish community who were around at that time and talked about the fears it caused for Jewish people. And several people talked about the actual trial.
Right.
And the frenzy in the streets at the trial. And Cliff tried to run down it's a white boy working at the pencil factory where
Leo Frank worked.
Leo Frank had been a manager.
The manager, exactly.
And we nearly found him a couple times, and Cliff kept losing him in the sense that he didn't spend very much time in Atlanta at the time. But he wanted to talk about it, and he finally, after our program and all was gone, he did talk about it, and that's now part of the whole story of Leo Frank. But Cliff got so close to him, but didn't quite do it.
Couldn't quite do everything that he wanted to.
A couple of those other professors were people just talking about academic people that Cliff interviewed was John Griffin, Emory alumnus and Georgia Tech professor, and Brewer, Earl Brewer, Emory alumnus and professor.
So why are you mentioning those, Harlon?
Because Cliff really was impressed by them.
Yeah.
Because of the work that they were doing?
What they'd done, too.
What they had done in the past?
There was a few liberals that were important in Atlanta during this period of time we did. And it's been an interesting history of that liberal and radical activity in the South during this time, come out now by, what's her name, Gilmore, I think is her last name. I can't think of her first name.
See, this is interesting. It goes back to what I was saying earlier, that you all were in this project, you were talking with people an oral history of what they experienced, but also the reaction to it and ways of trying to improve the life for people in Atlanta and the South. And Cliff got really interested in that. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, Bernard. Bernard, go ahead.
Yeah, but that's a part of the influence of this particular Living Atlanta project. Both you could bring your own interest in, like we came in and we would pitch different ideas that maybe had been with broad brushstrokes, but the influence of the overall project supported Cliff into many of his other endeavors and his other interests as well. It all could shoot off from this project because it was so broad and immense.
We're going to take a quick break and we'll be back in just a moment. Stay tuned. Again, my name is Heather Gray. The program is Just Peace. We're talking about Cliff Kuhn, actually, and I have here in the studio Harlon Joye and also Bernard West, who were involved with Cliff in the Living Atlanta series project in the late 1970s. We're talking about how this reverberated, and one of the things was ultimately the creation of the Living Atlanta book by the University of Georgia Press. It was Living Atlanta, an oral history in the city of Atlanta from 1914 to 1948, but we've also been talking about how some other years were engaged with as well as a spin-off from this project. But so let's talk about this book. Now, you all, this was, as we said, it was meant, the Living Atlanta project was meant to be a radio series, which it was, an award-winning radio series. So Cliff decided that all these radio interviews needed to be transcribed. Am I right, Harlon?
Well, we both talked about it. I mean, all three had talked about it one time or another. Dana White particularly was interested in that getting done, but we hadn't picked up anybody that really wanted to publish it and go forward with it. And we talked to University of Georgia before this, but they had said, we don't want something that just does the programs. It'd have to be something totally different. So when we started working on it, we tried to come out with something that would look a good bit different. I'll tell you, I, for one, didn't have any idea how much space it would take to do those 26 programs. This book doesn't touch the program.
Okay, all right.
It touches a little tiny bit, a tiny bit.
Okay, but you must also realize that different people, those programs have been made available to the public now.
Right.
And not just the radio program,
but the actual interviews.
But the actual interviews themselves. Right. And it is a resource. It's a historical resource because none of the people who were interviewed are still alive.
All these programs are in a repository at Atlanta History Center. And I was told by one of the people up there that it's the most visited archive they have.
Interesting.
Yeah,
interesting.
And it's now it's been digitalized recently. But Cliff, on the book, Cliff was the one that talked to the University of Georgia finally and got them interested in really doing it as a book. I mean, he sold it that way.
Excellent.
And then
But that was Cliff, you know, and we would then get together. We got together at your house on several occasions where we would talk about how to go forward with the project and what we would all do as a result of Cliff having obtained this interest at the University of Georgia.
Right, and Cliff raised the money for it. Because, see, we didn't do transcripts. We didn't do transcripts for the programs. I wasn't interested in seeing on a page of paper what I wanted to put into hearing.
Right.
When it's already in hearing. So
you were talking about this, Harlon, the distinction between something on the written page and actually hearing a voice.
Yeah.
Explain that.
Well, it makes a tremendous difference. Where's the emphasis? Where's the excitement? I mean, where is that placed? And when you got the person talking, you got that. You got when their voice goes up and down, when they're excited, when they're not excited, when somebody says, and it was a hard life.
Yeah.
I remember one of the baseball players saying that.
Yeah. Or you would get a guy like Roy Dunn, who was a blues musician. He said, "Oh, man, good God, I'd be running now knowing I ain't done nothing. Police would come into your house and beat you nearly to death." You know, so these kinds of things were what made for the radio. And I think that your idea, Heather, to maybe set up a program where you would play a program and then have people call in, have us discuss what would happen. And I think one of the first ones you need to do is that Roy Dunn.
What I wanted to say, though, was Cliff went out and raised the money to do all the transcripts, and that's not cheap.
No.
And this says corporate donors, AT&T, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, CNS Bank, Citizens Trust, First Atlantic Bank, Georgia Pacific, Georgia Power, Riches, and Southern Bell.
He did all of that. Wow,
that
amazing.
was Cliff.
Good for Cliff.
That was Cliff.
And then Cliff did the actual pulling out what we'd cover and some of the other writing. And we got little vignettes in here. I think I did all those, but he pulled it together and then came to us. And he did the research. There's a lot of marvelous pictures in here.
Yeah.
And he pulled up a whole stack, and we went through them and picked the ones we got. But he was the one that went out and found them.
And I think that right now, you know, the fact that Cliff did this work, you know, this work wouldn't be in existence. The radio program, the Live in Atlanta, and all of that would be available. But this book, the Live in Atlanta book itself, is Cliff's baby.
It's thanks to Cliff, yeah.
Yes, it's thanks to Cliff.
Yeah.
We came along with it, but thanks to Cliff that this document exists. I think that it's a great testament to his fortitude and his vision and his tenacity, because he had to go through a lot of changes to make this happen, and I applaud him.
All right. Thank you for that, Bernard. I do want to mention, and we haven't talked about this, but I do want to mention some of the roles that Cliff played here at WRFG. He was, for a while, the president of the board of directors. He was the first producer of WRFG's labor program. So, and then, of course, being involved with the Living Atlanta program. But I know that Kevin has a question. Kevin, go ahead.
Oh, sure. I guess, so one of the things that I was interested in is kind of the way that Cliff views history, and I think you all kind of share some of that, and that is that he really wanted to tell history from the point of view of regular people. I think one of the things that the Living Atlanta series does is it validates a lot of things that regular people, particularly black folks, knew was going on in the city that, maybe wasn't recorded in the academic halls of history. So I was wondering if you could tell me maybe a little more about that, about the unwritten deadline that people had to be inside, stuff like that.
Oh yeah, that was a result of several different interviewees telling us that that was an unofficial curfew in Atlanta for black people, and that if you weren't off the street by a certain time at night, the police would have their way with you. And
unless you had a pass.
If you didn't have a pass from your employer. And this was not something that had been documented in mainstream Atlanta history at that time. This was something that came as a result of these particular interviews, and it was later on recognized and sanctioned as being valid history and being substantiated.
Are we talking about the period between the wars?
Yes.
Yeah.
I see.
And there were a number of things like that. But the real thing is we wanted to talk to people who were people, not officials,
Well,
not major
it was
figures.
bottom-up history as opposed to top-down history.
And in fact, actually, all the people who did the announcers, you might have said, who filled in the blanks, filled in talking on the programs, they were all non-professionals.
Yes.
They were all our people. And we had some problems with some of them at times.
Well, they were volunteers.
Of course.
We just had to manage volunteers.
Yeah. But when the National Public Radio took some of the programs, they went through that and pulled all that out and put in professionals to do all that.
So that's a good way to end this interview, because I do want to mention that I think is one of the important aspects of this project, that it was done by an independent media entity that was making the decisions about what was to be done in the Living Atlanta project, which was to talk with the people. Right? Whereas if you were a part of NPR or a corporate-owned entity, this probably would not have been possible.
It wouldn't have sounded like
It wouldn't have been the same.
It would not have been the same.
It wouldn't have been the same.
So I'm wanting to thank you all so much. Again, we've been talking with Harlon Joye, founder, actually, of WRFG, as well as Bernard West, about the Living Atlanta project that took place in 1977 and 1978, and the reverberations about this, and in particular, the work that Cliff Kuhn did on this and his great contributions to continuing this understanding and information about Atlanta. And a lot of this stemmed from his work on the Living Atlanta project.